This is The Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham. Dr. Keisha N. Blain is a historian, speaker, advocate, and social justice activist. She is also a professor of Africana Studies at Brown University. Her most recent book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights, takes a historical look back at various civil rights movements and the Black women behind the scenes who helped create global change. Dr. Blain recently spoke at Wayne State University as part of the university's annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemoration. I spoke with Dr. Blain about the importance of highlighting the women who helped move civil rights in this country and globally.
The focus is really on a number of women who helped to shape the civil rights movement. I'll certainly talk about some of the women who I think many people are familiar with, including Coretta Scott King, but I'll also talk about others who are just as significant, but may not have received as much attention, I think, in mainstream narratives. And this includes, of course, Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a dynamic civil rights leader from the state of Mississippi. I'll also talk about some women who I center in my own work, including Aretha McKinley from the D.C. area. And the really, I think the thrust of the speech will be on thinking about how these women helped to make King's larger vision real. They worked at the grassroots level. They certainly worked alongside of him in many cases. And they advocated strongly for not only civil rights, but also for human rights.
And I want to stick with Fannie Lou Hamer, if we could, for just a little bit, because she was a sharecropper and, also an activist. She was so many different things. Who was she for those who don't know who she was, and why do her words still resonate today?
Yes, as you point out, she was a sharecropper from the state of Mississippi. One of the things that is so important to know about her is that she came to politics fairly late in life. She joined the civil rights movement well in her 40s. And at the time, she said that she had no idea that she could even vote as a citizen of the United States. And so it's truly a powerful story because this is someone who lived in the South, worked as a sharecropper for much of her life, and attended a meeting in 1962 in which she learned about voting rights for the first time. And that changed her life dramatically. She went from finding out about voting rights to then being one of the leading figures in the struggle for voting rights. And she had limited formal education, limited financial resources, but left such an indelible mark on the nation and, quite frankly, the world. She organized throughout the South, but also organized throughout other parts of the country. And she played such a critical role in not only the civil rights movement, but also the women's rights movement. So she is such a courageous figure. I talk about her as someone who was an unlikely leader in many ways because people were surprised by her. She didn't fit the usual mold, if you will, of what we often think about as the leader. But she was, in fact, very influential and impactful as a leader in the movement.
And you talk about 1962, she's finding out, for the first time about voting rights and all the information that she needs to vote. Talk about the importance of knowledge to her at that time and what knowledge did to her, because it pushed her to be more proactive and more active on the ground.
Absolutely. In fact, within 2 years of her finding out about voting rights, we find her at the Democratic National Convention giving perhaps one of the most impactful speeches of her political career, a speech that was so impactful, in fact, that the president at the time tried to divert attention away from the speech because Hamer was just so effective at reaching people, at tugging at their hearts, helping them to see just the injustices that Black people were enduring in the United States. And so the knowledge was truly impactful. We often say knowledge is power, and it's true. And quite frankly, Hamer's story underscores what that truly means, to find out that you have the right to vote, to have that particular bit of information truly revolutionize your life, change you dramatically That ultimately is her story. She learns about this and she realizes that the power of the vote is in fact the way forward. She realizes that she can not only change her life, but she could make a difference in the lives of so many others simply by advocating to vote. It's her way of exercising her constitutional rights, certainly, but it's also her way of making sure that laws can be changed that would in fact uphold and protect civil and human rights for all people. So it is a remarkable story about finding out the truth and then making a difference.
So on one end, we have Fannie Lou Hamer, who is coming from a certain demographic, or I guess you can say a certain aspect of Black life at that time. But then you have Aretha McKinley, who was coming from a different angle, but also attacking civil rights movement or attacking the civil rights movement as well as human rights in general. So could you talk about how these two women, these are just two examples, of course, but these two women attacked civil rights, the civil rights movement, and human rights from different angles?
Yes, what's so interesting about Aretha McKinley is that much of her work was taking place in the D.C. area. And a lot of people don't know who she is, but she was one of the earliest lobbyists, a human rights activist who was in the nation's capital early 1960s. She was working at the grassroots level, very similar to Fannie Lou Hamer. She was advocating for the right to vote. She was emphasizing the importance of Black people casting a ballot. And for her, she was also thinking about human rights broadly, connecting the local struggle, the national struggle with the global one. She helped to organize workshops. One of the workshops that she organized was at Howard University. This is early 1960s. She's part of the American Council on Human Rights, and in fact, became the first woman elected to serve as the national director of the group. She was involved in just, as I said, the grassroots organizing, but also the lobbying arm. That part is key. The lobbying arm of the Black Greek letter organizations. She brought together sororities, Black sororities, and Black fraternities interested in civil rights advocacy, and hosted a number of events in the D.C. area to push for expanded Black rights. And so very powerful story of another woman in a different context, in a different part of the country, doing similar kind of work and using her knowledge of the law and public policy to push these ideas forward.
So, history hasn't forgotten about Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or the other influential men of the civil rights movement, but it did leave out and forget some of the women who are important. Why is it important to expand the narrative when we talk about the civil rights movement and including Black women within the leadership of the civil rights movement?
Well, I always remind people that no movement is successful simply because of one individual, no matter how influential that person might be. And so it's not to de-emphasize or perhaps devalue the contributions of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, we understand the pivotal role that he played. But part of what I'm doing in centering these women is to show that they too were part of this larger vision and this larger effort. And in fact, the speech that I will give at Wayne State, I opened with Martin Luther King Jr. talking about the power of Black leaders at the grassroots level, the importance of people who are working together, as he explained it, individuals who are willing to meet hate with love, willing to meet physical force with soul force, as he phrased it. And the speech really lays out examples of women who were doing exactly that. So the emphasis is really thinking about how someone as influential and inspirational as King is very much connected to a larger group of individuals, including women at the grassroots, at the national level, and even at the international level, who played such a pivotal role in shaping the movement and who continue to play a pivotal role in shaping the movement for civil and human rights.
It's common in the Black community to understand the idea of creating spaces, lanes, and avenues so you can exist with dignity. Yet Black women exist within communities, intersections, whether it's being both Black and a woman and so on and so forth. So what did those intersections look like for Black women? And how did they carve out their own lanes to have a voice within the civil rights movement?
Well, one of the challenges that Black women often endured in the civil rights movement And this is, I think, true in so many ways today, is that they often face resistance to their leadership. Of course, we have to think about the role of patriarchy. There is still, in many circles, religious as well as political, still this kind of male-dominated expectation when it comes to leadership. And even when women are, in fact, leaders, not often recognized as such, having to work behind the scenes as opposed to working at the forefront because of these kinds of responses. And so women had to deal with that. They had to, of course, fight racism, but at times also they had to fight sexism internally as well as externally. And so it meant really trying to work with leaders of diverse backgrounds, but also resisting efforts to contain women's voices and influence. And so women certainly found ways to do that. And one of the ways that they did that was certainly within their own groups. We see, for example, Black women's clubs. We see Black sororities as just examples of spaces in which women were able to engage in political activism and do so on their own terms, even when they were not necessarily allowed a seat at the table. They simply created their own spaces, their own tables in which to advocate for the things that mattered most to them. So Black women have always been, I think, creative and resilient, and they have been persistent to keep pushing despite patriarchal resistance, despite, all kinds of, I think, challenges that they face within political, religious, and other kinds of social groups.
Now, Dr. Blain, your most recent book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. Can you talk about how those women helped lead to where we are today and some of the things that they were doing and how those themes still show up today in terms of women's involvement within civil rights movements and human rights movements?
Yes, one of the things that I emphasize in the book is just how pivotal Black women were and continue to be when it comes to shaping human rights history. At a practical level, for example, I talk about the contributions of Black women when it comes to the formation of the United Nations. That's something people don't often think about. I talk about, for example, Mary McLeod Bethune, who in fact played a pivotal role in the drafting of the Charter for the United Nations. So think about what it means that Black women were present from the very beginning, present in the room, contributing to the dialogue around how we conceptualize human rights, what we mean by the term, how we advocate for human rights within a national context, but more importantly, a global context. So think about Black women shaping human rights discourse at a global level. It doesn't mean that Black women were always listened to, as I talk about in that book. Even Mary McLeod Bethune, while present at the founding meeting in San Francisco in 1945, encountered resistance. I've mentioned some of the kinds of challenges that Black women have faced. She certainly faced them. Everyone didn't listen to her all the time. But the fact that she was present and the fact that she could contribute to this dialogue, and within a year of her involvement, I talk about how other Black women end up playing a role in the early years of the United Nations, sometimes working behind the scenes. Many of their names are not well known, but I center their stories in my work to show that Black women have always been interested in this question of human dignity and how to ensure that not only Black people have the rights that are due to them, but that every single person will be protected and have the rights that are guaranteed to them simply because they are human. So it is a remarkable story about Black women being at the forefront, even when people don't pay attention to them.
Yes, yes. And if you could, just a little bit further, talking about your book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. When you were writing and researching and uncovering different things, what were some things that surprised you, even as a historian, learning about Black women's involvement within human rights and just the furthering of our country, but then, like you said, globally?
Well, I think what really surprised me is that even as these women were facing resistance at the local level, even as they were dealing with challenges in their own communities, within their own homes, there were individuals who I talk about who were literally struggling to make ends meet. They weren't sure where the next meal would come from as they were trying to take care of their children, their families. At the same time that they were grappling with these very real issues, they were also thinking about what was happening in South Africa, for example, or what was happening in the Caribbean. They were always attuned to this larger world. They were always attuned to the fact that the challenges that Black people were facing in the U.S. could not be divorced from what was happening globally. And that to me is remarkable. I think it's easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day. It's easy to get bogged down with the challenges we face in our communities. Certainly there's a lot going on nationally to keep our attention. But I'm always amazed by how these women didn't get bogged down. They certainly paid attention to what was happening in their communities. They paid attention to the national story, but they saw the connections in a way that's truly remarkable. And they were looking for ways to forge alliances across, the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, it's really remarkable at a time where they didn't have social media, right? The way that we have certain tools today. And so that's inspiring to think about these women's really global vision. That truly is a remarkable aspect. And I'm always amazed by that.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. That's amazing to think about. But I was reading and looking up and just interested in your studies and the things that you've been able to bring to the forefront, especially when we talk about resources and conversations. And I stumbled upon the African American Intellectual Society, and I was reading through and I saw something that was really interesting, but it was the role that the Black church played within the civil rights movement and how women were able to carve out their spaces using the church as well. Could you expand on that a little bit if you can?
Absolutely. Certainly the Black church has provided space, even just a physical space for organizing. We see, for example, someone like Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council in the context of Montgomery, Alabama, coming together in Black churches in order to strategize. In fact, it's within these spaces that we see the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. We often, of course, talk about Rosa Parks. That is certainly part of the story, but it's not the full story. We have to step back to the 40s where the Women's Political Council, right, where they're coming together, they're gathering in local churches, and they're talking about what Black people are experiencing on the buses, and they're coming up with ways to respond. They write a letter to call out the mistreatment of Black people on the buses. They demand changes. All that is happening before we get to the well-known Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. So the church has been such a pivotal role, has played such a pivotal role, especially when Black women have been shut out of the more formal spaces for political engagement. The church then has allowed them to still be involved politically, even as we talk about these churches as religious spaces, but they're much more than that. They function as social spaces, spaces where people can find support in the day-to-day. They function as political spaces where people can advocate strongly for changes to the law, and push for public policy changes. So I think churches, of course, a lot has changed with time, but even in the modern context, many churches still provide spaces for people to be involved politically, and that is true for other religious spaces too.
And Dr. Blain, just hearing you talk about the bus boycotts, Montgomery, Alabama, I instantly thought of the woman that I had found out about growing in college was Claudette Colvin. And I had no idea who she was until I took a class. I learned a little bit more about her. And that's when I really started to understand that there was so much more. There's a larger picture that wasn't being told, a larger story that wasn't being told about the civil rights movement. So when we think about people like Claudette and so many other American activists who have gone unsung, their stories have gone unnoticed, how can learning about these women, especially their role within the civil rights movement, help people get active today?
Well, I think it truly is inspiring. And in so many ways, when we learn these stories, it forces us to stop making excuses. So you mentioned Claudette Colvin. She was only 15 years old. 15 years old. And I think about, I mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer earlier. Someone having limited formal education. She went up to the 6th grade, did not have much money, did not have a lot of, access and connections that many of the other activists had. And yet she left such an indelible mark on the world. What excuse do we have? Well, honestly, what excuse do we have to make a difference? And so I always impress upon people, look in the mirror, figure out what you can offer. You may not have a lot. You don't need a lot, but you have a certain skill. You have something you can contribute. You have certain gifts. You have certain talents. Use them. Use them effectively to make a difference. And certainly that's what I've been trying to do through my writing, through my research. And so I think the more we learn about these stories, the more they inspire us to make a difference.
Black women as local organizers, activists, mayors, vice presidents, this is something that I grew up just kind of expecting to see. And a lot of other people have expected just to see Black women in these spaces, in these places. What do you hope this information will do for people in today's current political landscape, seeing that there are Black women who are so forefront and present? Like, once again, I'm in a Black city, one of the Blackest cities in the nation, with a Black mayor. So Black woman mayor at that. So what does that tell us about today's political landscape and all the other Black women that we see right now in politics? What is it telling us?
Well, a lot has changed. I think one of the hallmarks of this particular moment is that we're able to see Black women holding very visible leadership positions, and certainly that's a bit different. We don't have to always talk about women behind the scenes. And that, of course, women continue to play leaders behind the scenes. But my point is that we are at a moment where Black women have opportunities to be more visible. They can hold an array of public positions as public servants. They are able to contribute in a way that's not as hidden as we see in past examples. But perhaps one of the things that remains true is that Black women are still, I think, often struggling for support. And when I say support, I'm talking about support broadly. What we find is that when Black women step up to lead, they're constantly facing resistance. They're constantly having to prove their worth. They have to demonstrate over and over again, day by day, proving their competency. There's a way in which people just always assume that they don't know what they're saying, or they don't have the expertise, that they don't have the experience. And quite frankly, as we know, Black women are one of the most educated in the nation. So I always find it interesting that they're constantly having to prove themselves when, quite frankly, they shouldn't have to. So even as things have changed in the way that Black women are able to lead, they're still dealing with similar challenges. And what I hope would change is that more people would step up to support Black women leaders. Doesn't mean we can't critique them. It doesn't mean we can't point out ways that they have to improve. Of course, that's just part of the process. I think politically, certainly when we're doing public work, we have to be open to that. But it means that they should have more support. And I would like to see that happening.
That was Dr. Keisha N. Blain, a historian, speaker, advocate, and social justice activist. She is also a professor of Africana Studies at Brown University. She recently spoke at Wayne State University during its annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative event. Coming up, racial progress is often framed as a movement that happened solely in the South. A new book explores King's life across the United States fighting for equality. You all stay right there. This is The Metro.